Herbert Spencer. You've probably heard the name, maybe you've heard the phrase survival of the fittest thrown around. But for someone who is, without a doubt, a founder of sociology, his legacy is, well, it's really controversial and honestly super misunderstood. So let's get into it and try to separate the man from the myth.
So what is the deal with Spencer? Was he this brilliant scientific mind who basically laid the groundwork for modern sociology? Or was he a pretty biased philosopher whose ideas were, let's just say, a little problematic? The truth, like it almost always is somewhere in the middle. And it's a fascinating story of two completely different projects he was working on.
Okay, so a ton of the controversy, a lot of the heat he gets, it comes from his very first book, Social Statics. In it, he laid out this moral philosophy that was all based on one big idea. People are happiest when they can do whatever they want as long as it doesn't stop anyone else from doing what they want. And this led him to this political stance of extreme laissez-faire. I mean, he argued for a government that was barely even there.
And this is the absolute key to understanding Spencer. We have to separate his two projects. On one side, you've got his political and ethical arguments, what some have called his moral ramblings, which even he admitted later had some flaws. And yeah, this is a huge reason he's so controversial, but it's not what made him a giant in his field. So for the rest of this explainer, we're going to focus on his second, way more influential project, his serious, scientific attempt to figure out the universal laws that make societies tick.
And his scientific work started with a breathtakingly huge idea. He thought he'd found a single, universal process that governed the entire cosmos.
Yeah, you heard that right. In his book, First Principles, he argued that everything in the universe, from galaxies forming to an organism growing to human societies developing, all of it follows one master process: evolution. For Spencer, evolution wasn't just for the biologists. It was the fundamental law of absolutely everything. So how does this cosmic evolution actually work? Well, he broke it down into 3 stages. First, you get aggregation, where simple, unorganized stuff just clumps together. Then comes differentiation, where that bigger clump starts to develop different, specialized parts. And finally, you get integration, where all those different parts get connected and start working together as one complex system. It's a move from simple to complex to a coordinated, complex whole. Okay, so you've got this grand theory of everything. How do you apply it to something as messy and complicated as human society? Well, Spencer needed a tool, an analogy, to help make sense of it all. And his choice became one of his most famous and, most misunderstood ideas. He used what's called the organismic analogy. He argued that societies are like living organisms. And I have to stress that. He didn't say they are organisms. He said they're like them. Why? Because both are super complex systems made of all these interdependent parts, so he figured they must share some basic rules of organization. It was really just a framework for thinking about it.
And when you look, you can see these parallels all over the place. Both societies and organisms grow bigger. As they grow, their internal structures get way more complex and specialized. And this is the big one. A change in one part ripples out and affects all the other parts. I mean, just think about how a recession can affect families, politics, education, everything. That's the kind of interdependence he was talking about.
But, and this is so important, Spencer wasn't a fool. He knew this analogy wasn't perfect. In fact, he was the first person to point out all the ways it breaks down. The parts of a body are literally fused together. People in a society are spread out. A body uses chemical signals to communicate. Society uses language and symbols. And maybe the biggest difference of all, in an organism, consciousness is located in one spot, the brain. In a society, every single person is a conscious, thinking being. So if society is this complex, evolving system, what's actually pushing it forward? What's the engine that drives all that change? I mean, how do you get from a small tribe to a massive modern nation? Spencer's key idea here was a process he called compounding. It's basically when smaller social groups get joined together into larger ones. Think about families forming a clan, or clans merging to form a tribe, or one nation conquering another and absorbing it. Societies get bigger by joining up, whether they want to or not. And as these societies get bigger and bigger through compounding, they start to differentiate. They develop these 3 core systems. You've got the regulatory system, that's your government, military, all the stuff that controls things. Then there's the operative system, which handles making things and making people, so the economy and the family. And finally, the distributive system, which moves everything around, goods, information, people. Think roads, trade, communication. But here's the catch. The bigger and more complicated a society gets, the harder it is to keep the whole thing from falling apart. How do you coordinate all these new, specialized parts? Spencer called this the problem of integration. And this is where his theory gets really intense. Spencer argued that conflict, especially war, is a huge selection pressure. Why? Well, because a society that's actually solved its integration problems, one that's well organized and coherent, is almost always going to beat one that's a disorganized mess. Conflict literally forces societies to get better at working together, or they get destroyed. This led into a really sharp theory about geopolitics, which he saw as a cycle. It all starts with a threat, either from outside, like an invader, or from inside, like a rebellion. So what do leaders do when they're threatened? They centralize power. They build armies, they create police forces, they consolidate control. But all that new, concentrated power has consequences. It gets used to squeeze resources out of the population to pay for wars and make the elites rich. And this, of course, creates a massive gap between the rich and the poor, which leads to resentment and conflict inside the society itself. And all that resentment creates brand new internal threats. Now the elites have to deal with an angry population, which forces them to centralize even more power just to keep control. You see the feedback loop here? A threat leads to centralization, which creates new threats, which demands even more centralization. It's a cycle that just keeps feeding on itself. So, putting aside all these huge, sweeping theories about evolution and conflict, what did Spencer actually leave behind for the science of sociology? Once we clear away the dust from all the controversy, what's his real, lasting legacy? And this might just be the most surprising part of his entire body of work. Way before it was fashionable, Spencer was deeply worried about a very modern problem: scientific bias. He knew that because sociologists are part of the very thing they're studying, it's incredibly hard to be objective. Just look at the kinds of bias he was writing about in his book, The Study of Sociology. He wrote whole chapters warning researchers about their own educational bias, the bias of patriotism, their class bias, their political bias, how all of it could totally cloud their judgment. For the 1870s, this was unbelievably forward-thinking. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, his contribution is just immense. He's a pioneer of functionalism. That's the whole idea of analyzing how different parts of society meet its needs. He's an early developer of conflict theory, showing how war shapes social change. His geopolitical cycle is a sophisticated theory of state power that still feels relevant today. And with his work on bias, he helped lay the very foundations of sociological methodology. I mean, these aren't just historical footnotes. These are core pillars of sociology. And that brings us right back to Spencer's main idea. And it leaves us with a really powerful question. If he's right, and if societies are constantly evolving, growing, differentiating, integrating, always facing new problems, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's the next stage for our society?